So what happens when a kid's search for just logical answers ends up completely changing their entire life? That's what we're getting into today, the incredible story of Firdaus Wong. His journey of faith didn't start with some big mystical vision. Nope, it all began with a simple question. This right here, this is the question that kicked everything off. For most kids, that's just a fleeting thought, something you might wonder about for a second and then forget. But for a young Firdaus Wong, it was this intellectual puzzle that he just had to solve. And it sent him down a path that I don't think he ever saw coming. Okay, so let's set the scene. We're in Malaysia, and Firdaus is being raised as what you'd call a cultural Buddhist. This basically means his faith was built more on the traditions and rituals he saw his family do, and less on, deep theological study. But a family tragedy was about to make him look at everything a whole lot closer. He was just 11, only 11 years old when his grandfather passed away. And it was at the funeral, a time that's supposed to be about grief and tradition, that he started noticing these logical problems. And for him, they were just impossible to ignore. I mean, try to imagine you're 11 and you're seeing this. On one side, you've got priests chanting and doing all these rituals, and the whole point is to send your grandfather's soul to paradise. Okay, makes sense. But then, at the very same time, the family is over here burning what they call hell banknotes, literally money for him to use in hell, just in case he ends up there. To him, the two things they didn't add up. Yeah, see, he'd always been taught a pretty simple rule. You're good, you go to paradise. You're bad, you get punished in hell. But this whole ritual seemed to suggest that, you could just buy your way to a pretty comfortable afterlife, even if you landed in hell. So the big question in his mind was, what's the point of being a good person then? And he didn't just let it go. He kept at it, asking his aunts and his uncles to try and explain this contradiction. But his logical questions were just met with frustration. Their final answer wasn't an answer at all. It was basically an order to just stop thinking. But come on, for a curious 11-year-old, that was never going to happen. So those unanswered questions just sat with him. And as he got into his teenage years, he kind of drifted away from the religion he grew up with. He started calling himself a free thinker. He still believed there was a God, but he was absolutely convinced that God couldn't be something man-made, like a statue. He started really looking at some of the folk religions around him, and he noticed a pattern. It went something like this. A good, respected person dies, people remember all the great things they did, and then, after a while, historians or elders would basically promote that person to the level of a god. He saw this whole thing as a purely human process. And this was his killer question. He'd go up to his friends and ask, look, if people can promote a man to become a god, then who actually has more power here? It's such a sharp, logical point. He'd use this analogy. If he could hire and fire a CEO, then he's the one with the real power, not the CEO, and he argued the same logic applied to these gods. But, tearing down all the beliefs around him, it came with a price. Without any kind of spiritual anchor that actually made sense to him, he just felt empty. For about 4 years, from when he was 18 to 22, he tried to fill that void with nightlife, going to clubs, pubs, several times a week. But that feeling of emptiness, it just got bigger. And then, at 22, he hit a real turning point. He'd gotten injured, was feeling pretty lost and alone, and he finally decided to ask a Muslim friend a direct question. He was hoping, just hoping, to find an answer that his logical mind could finally latch onto. So he laid out his main issue, which, let's be honest, is a pretty common viewpoint. Seeing is believing. He needed physical, visible proof. How could he possibly believe in a God that he couldn't see with his own 2 eyes? Now, his friend didn't launch into some complex theological lecture. He just came back with this one simple question. And it was a question so simple, but it was about to completely reframe Firdaus's entire way of thinking about belief and evidence. And just think about that for a second. We don't actually see the wind, right? What we see are the effects of the wind. We see the leaves moving, the trees swaying back and forth, dust getting kicked up. We believe the wind exists because we see all this undeniable proof that it's there. And that was the final piece of the analogy that just hit him so hard. If a simple creation of God like the wind is invisible to us, why on earth would we expect to be able to see the infinitely powerful creator of that wind? We see the evidence of the creator in all of creation itself. This was it. This was the breakthrough. It was the first idea of God that finally satisfied that logical requirement he'd had since he was an 11-year-old at that funeral. A God who is the ultimate creator, not something that could be created or promoted or defined by other people. So, with that huge intellectual roadblock gone, he made his decision. He was going to become a Muslim. But the very first step he took wasn't in a mosque. It was a phone call home, to the one person whose opinion mattered the most to him, his mother. And her reaction, well, it was incredibly down to earth. She didn't argue with him. She just gave him some advice. Don't play with religion. Be serious. So in 2005, he recited the Shahada, the simple declaration of faith, and from that day forward, he was all in. He immediately stopped all the old habits, like the clubbing, that were forbidden in his new faith. For 6 years, he just practiced his faith quietly, kind of kept to himself. But then, some words from a teacher really hit him hard. Firdaus was making excuses for not sharing his faith, and the teacher reminded him that he would be held accountable for his own actions, not for how other people might react. And that just lit a fire under him to start really learning and sharing what he believed. And so, his new mission to share his faith started right at home with the person he was closest to, his mom. He never pressured her. Instead, he just gently invited her to see his world. Over many, many years, they had these open conversations. He told her once how happy he was that she was his mom in this life, and then he said it would be even better if she could be his mom in paradise too. It was this really emotional, heartfelt appeal that just planted a little seed for her to think about. And look, this wasn't some sudden, overnight conversion. Not at all. It was the result of years of just watching him. She saw her son become more patient, more responsible. She saw the respect he had for his family. Over more than a decade, his actions became the most powerful argument he could ever make. Finally, in 2019, he invited her to go to Mecca with him. He gently reminded her that non-Muslims couldn't enter the holy city. And her response was just so simple and so clear. Then, okay, La, let's become Muslim. And just like that, with those few words, his mother started her own journey. And in a way, it brought his own journey full circle. Firdaus Wong's story is such a powerful reminder that sometimes the biggest spiritual journeys don't start with some blind leap of faith. Sometimes they start with a single, logical question. He encourages people not just to question what others believe, but to have the courage to seriously question their own conclusions. And so the question he leaves us with is one we can probably all ask ourselves.